Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel, and this is another F1 fantasy video going ahead, but this time into the Hungarian Grand Prix. Now we've learnt a lot from Silverstone. This is what my team looked like. Of course, having Lando Norris didn't work out in the end. It almost worked out, but then bad strategy calls from McLaren didn't help our case. It would have been a great race for anyone who had Mercedes in their team. However, George Russell DNF'd, which caught a lot of people out. I very much got away quite lucky, and my team will be changing quite a lot going into next weekend. However, that pushes me back up into the top 2,500, so very happy with that. Make sure to like and subscribe, follow me on Twitter, join my Discord if you want to discuss more F1/F1 fantasy chats, and join my league as we now have over 800 people in it. So the first thing we need to discuss is if Mercedes can keep it up. So Mercedes did have a really good weekend in Britain with Hamilton winning, of course. They got unlucky with Russell. However, the issue with Mercedes as assets is they go from one track looking really good to another track where they do look good, but not the best. So will they be as good in Hungary? I think they'll be good. However, if there's no rain, I don't see them being anywhere close to first position. And when I say anywhere, I mean they'll probably be around third position to around sixth position, but I don't think they'll be fighting for any wins. That still means they're good as F1 fantasy assets. Hamilton and Russell, they are still on the cheap side for premium drivers, and there's a lot of budget movement that could happen with Mercedes assets as a whole. So keep an eye on them, and it's really important that you look at the practice sessions, as this will help you pick your teams. But for now, my best bet is it will be another Red Bull McLaren fight going into Hungary. Then, of course, we need to talk about Ferrari. I'll keep it short and simple, as there's not much to discuss about it. They are pretty bad. That's the only thing you need to know. Do not use any of their assets. I'm talking Leclerc, Sainz, or Ferrari in general. They've not looked good for the last few weekends. I don't see Ferrari getting anywhere close to the top four, so I'd be careful with having any of them as assets. Then we have another issue of Verstappen versus Lando, especially in single premium driver teams. This was the first weekend for a while. Verstappen scored more points than Norris, but I still think Norris outbeats Verstappen, as Norris still had a better chance of getting driver of the day, and with both of them not getting fastest lap, it didn't matter too much. The points gap wasn't too crazy, and considering Norris has been doing so much better F1 fantasy wise than Verstappen in the last few weekends, I still think Norris is the way to go, even for single premium driver builds. Now let's talk about the top drivers for under 8 million, and funnily enough, it has to be Valtteri Bottas this weekend. I slate him a lot in my videos. However, at a track like Hungary, we only got 16 overtakes last season, and a lot of them were just George Russell getting up through the field. Bear that in mind. I think it's very much another track where qualifying, unlike a lot of tracks in F1 fantasy, is going to be key, as normally you'd want overtake points and position gain points. However, in Hungary, you sort of just want to get good in qualifying and sort of stick there. So I believe Bottas has the best bet out of Zhou and Sargent to be doing something like that. I then think it's Logan Sargent's second place, as we saw in Silverstone, Williams had decent pace. He had a decent qualifying. Let's see if he can do it again. However, Zhou in last place, he never does well in qualifying. I don't expect him to do well here, and his race pace hasn't actually been that great anyway. So I think Zhou is definitely last. Sargent second because he's cheap, and he's got a really far outside chance of not getting top 10, but at least getting top 15. And Bottas, he could potentially get top 12, top 13 if things go his way. Then let's have a look at the top drivers under 11 million, and one name sticks out above all in a qualifying priority track, which would be Nico Hülkenberg. Even if it wasn't about qualifying, he has been doing tremendously in F1 fantasy and just in F1 as a whole the last few weekends. I think he'll be just as good in Hungary. Expect him to be able to get into the top 10. He's definitely the best cheap driver you want to bring in, and I don't think there's anyone even close to his name right now. Then you have Kevin Magnussen, his teammate. Now it goes completely against everything I've just mentioned about really needing to focus on qualifying in Hungary, as there's not as many overtakes as a lot of the other tracks. However, Magnussen's one of those drivers who somehow just manages to find a way to score points. We've seen it in so many tracks where you think he's going to do nothing and he just blows us all away. So I think it'd be very stupid to not understate how much Magnussen could do as a driver himself. Then in third place we have Pierre Gasly, purely because yes, Albon had a shocker in Britain. It was a race to forget. He didn't start the race at all. However, again, I think if Alpine looked decent in practice, Gasly and even Ocon to a certain extent look very good for getting top 10 finishes. We know getting top 10 in qualifying and then holding on in the races. We know Gasly can do it better than Ocon. That's why Gasly's a better option for me, and he's cheaper. But both of them, all in all, if Alpine look good, they are the type of drivers who could do well in qualifying. Then we have Alex Albon at 9 million. The reason he's so good is because he's dirt cheap, and again, in that Williams, it looks like they've been having a bit better pace of recent. Still nothing to write home about. He's got an outside chance of getting close to the top 10 or even into the top 10, which is again what we want this weekend. Then we have both the V-Carbs at the bottom of my list, Sonoda and Ricciardo. Now the issue is they are both still good options to have. I just think, again, can't stress this enough, not as much as Monaco, but still very similar. There's not going to be many overtakes. If they qualify 18th and 17th, I would expect them, if they had a good weekend, to get up to 15th, 16th, which isn't good enough to be thinking about, considering when they're 10.9 million and 10.5 million. Then let's move on to the top drivers under 25 million. And funnily enough, I only actually have to speak about a few of them, as like I've said, do not go anywhere near the Ferrari assets of Leclerc or Sainz. They don't look good enough. And Perez as well. He's not been looking great recently, so I would not go anywhere near any of those options. Also, Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso are above the threshold of 15 million. Still wouldn't go near either of those two either. But I think the best option would be for now George Russell. I know, crazy. He DNF'd in the last race, but he was showing good pace. And again, out of him and his teammate and Piastri, who are the best premium drivers under 25 million, he's the one who normally pulls something off in qualifying. So, knowing this about George Russell, I think he has an outside chance of the possibility of getting a podium. I really like how he looks going into this weekend in Hungary. Then in second place, we have Oscar Piastri, where last season McLaren had a really good race. Piastri did fall off a bit at the end of the race, but I think now with a bit more experience around this track, and at a race where I think McLaren will be up there again, I expect them to be fighting for the pole positions, the podiums at least. I think also Piastri is a safe bet to have. He's not like the Mercedes where they could be a little bit more off than we think, but I still think in that qualifying aspect, he's not really there compared to Russell, Norris, Verstappen, so I could easily see him behind them, and that could hinder him as an option. Then we have Lewis Hamilton, and again, like I can't keep reinstating, he's been having bad qualifyings all season. Now, he's had a few good qualifying sessions, but I don't even think at a track like this, he could be saved by his good overtakes and his position gained points this season. So I'd be very wary, even though he had a really good race in Silverstone. He obviously won the race and he got the most points getting driver of the day. He blitzed it on F1 Fantasy and in just in F1 terms. He got his first race win for a long time, 2021. But I'd be a little bit careful around Hungary. I don't think he's the one you'd want to bring in right now. Over the long term, I think he's a very good option. But for this race alone, no chance. Then let's go have a look at some of the team selections. Now, 100% going into Hungary, the two premium driver option still seems like the best shout. As we've seen in Britain, as we've seen in the last few races, it's been very close between one single premium driver and two premium driver builds. However, with the two premium driver builds sort of opening up a little bit, this is the sort of team you could go for. Now, bear in mind, I'm only using Limitless to show you what you could get, but starting at 115.8 million, you could have Norris, Russell, Sargent, Zhou, Bottas with McLaren and Mercedes. Now, of course, if you have a little bit money to throw around, you could do something like this. And then if you have even more money to throw around, you could do something like this. And then if you have even more money on top of this, this will be the select few who've had amazing budget building this season. You could go on to 3 amazing cheap drivers. But all in all, 2 premium drivers looks really good. Of course, you've got Lando Norris, who looks set basically most weekends to be the favourite for driver of the day. You have Russell, who looks really good in qualifying, and Mercedes looks really strong at the minute. McLaren and Mercedes look like the best constructors at the minute as well. Red Bull closely behind, but they're very expensive. And don't forget, with any of the teams I did just show, you could also have it with Norris and Hamilton if he looks better in practice, or Norris and Piastri. Again, like I said, if McLaren look really good in practice, you might want to go all 3 assets McLaren. You could even go the opposite way with all 3 assets Mercedes if they look good. So there's a lot of variation you could use. However, my gut instinct this weekend is that Norris and Russell with McLaren and Mercedes with any cheap drivers. Of course, these are the best cheap drivers you could have. You could still use it with Zhou, Bottas and Sargent would be the best option to have. Then you have the one single premium driver teams, which would mainly consist of Norris as your big driver with McLaren and Red Bull. The reason you would go Red Bull instead of Mercedes on these sorts of teams is because you're hoping for the fastest pit stops. You're hoping that McLaren really smash it out of the park. This team is very much for if you can't afford the McLaren and Mercedes teams with two premium drivers, or if you just want to go with the safe bet, as Red Bull getting fastest pit stops, very safe. McLaren looking very good is a very safe option. Norris as your one single premium driver, a very good option. But of course you could also have this team with the likes of Verstappen. However, at this point it get quite expensive. Then you'd probably want to be moving over to the two premium driver teams by this point. And the same thing applies for if the one single premium driver build doesn't look amazing and you have to drop down to a Russell with Mercedes and McLaren. At that point, that's where you fully commit to the two premium driver build, as that would really help you out. So it really depends on what looks best. If Red Bull and McLaren look good, you go the one single premium driver build. If Red Bull don't look amazing and McLaren and Mercedes look like the two top dogs again, then you go over to that build. Again, with the cheap drivers on these single premium driver builds, you could go with very expensive cheap drivers if you have the money, or you could do these decreases I will show right now. Kevin Magnussen to Valtteri Bottas, Alex Albon down to Sargent, Gasly down to Zhou. However, with all of these teams, I'd recommend trying to stick with Nico Hülkenberg in all of them as much as possible. Then the budget increasing team would look like this. And basically it consists of the best premium drivers who could increase their value the most. Russell and Hamilton could easily increase 1 million if they have a good race. You have the best free cheap drivers who could all increase 0.5 million quite easily. Again though, if you can't afford these drivers, I would drop down. Again, you could use an Albon, you could use a Tsunoda if you only need a little bit more from Magnussen back down to Tsunoda. But Albon would be my best shout to drop one of the Gasly's, Magnussen's down to. Bear in mind, try to keep Hülkenberg as well. And then McLaren, even though they aren't a budget building team, are the most consistent points wise, and you still need to get good points with this team. And then again, Mercedes are the most likely to get that 1 million increase, and that's why they would be your second constructor as well. Then moving on to the cheap teams, let's start with an 100 million budget team, and I would go for something like this. Russell is the best premium driver you could get, and Hülkenberg is the best cheap driver you could get. Then up to 102.5 million, you could get this. Increasing Zhou up to Gasly, you're just getting a better cheap driver the more money you have. And then if you have 105 million, you would revert to something like this. Gasly back down to Zhou, and most importantly, getting in the driver who looks like he's going to score the most points, and that would be Lando Norris. But that is all the team selections for Hungary going into this weekend. Now let's have a look at the chips you could use. So this weekend, the chips will be pretty straightforward. Again, there's no sprint race weekend, so you don't have to use extra DRS, limitless, or autopilot, as they are much more efficient on weekends where you can use them on a sprint race weekend, and they amplify your points so much on sprint race weekends, it's ridiculous compared to a normal weekend. Then with no negative, if it looks like it could rain, potentially you could use it there. Again though, still better to use on a sprint race weekend, because you know for a fact if it's going to be sort of rainy, and you know if it looks like there's going to be more crashes or not from sprint qualifying and the race and all sorts. And then with the wildcard, I'd only recommend using it if you have enough to get to the Norris Russell builds with McLaren and Mercedes, and you've only got a single premium driver build, or you don't have any of the builds I showed before. And that's really it with the chips. I'll talk about Final Fix a little bit more in my live streams and my Friday video. However, it's not really a weekend I expect to see anyone using chips, as it's not the best weekend. There's not going to be high scoring points this weekend. There's not many overtakes. I doubt there's any reason to be using any chips. But anyway, let's go have a look at my league, and thank you all so much for joining it. We have over 800 people in the league as of now. Thank you all so much, and as always, here is a top 5 shout out. You have Colt V at Flatout in first place, congratulations. Leapers 1 in second place, no movements there. Jetto F1 staying in third place as well, congratulations. We have Band Sagging moving up to fourth place, congratulations. And then we have Enamadoji in 5th place. Congratulations to all 5 of you. Remember, there is a little prize for coming in the top 5. So thank you all so much for watching this video. I hope you could all come away with something that helps you out with your teams, who to pick, anything to do with F1 Fantasy from this video. And I hope you all enjoyed so much. So thank you all so much for watching. I'll see you all later with more F1 content and with some F1 Fantasy content as well. Bye bye.